Thank you very much for that introduction. And it's been a pleasure listening to the panels at this wonderful conference. I feel like we need a lot more kinds of interactions like these that bring down the barriers. And one of the things I would like to talk today about is the notion of the university as a space for Muslims. And I do that specifically by thinking about ethnic studies as a particular field in which Muslims can, with varying challenges, engage as a way of making connections to the community and questioning the boundaries between the insider and the outsider knowledge, as well as different kinds of institutions. Generally, in the Islamic context, we begin with Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. In the Western Academy, it is normal or normative to begin with a land recognition, which is very interesting practice that has developed in recent years, in which people, at least in the Western context of the United States, Canada, acknowledge the land that they're standing on is occupied, that the place where their universities have been founded are actually on land that has not been ceded by the indigenous people who were there and remain there. And my university, California State University, East Bay, which is in Hayward, is on the Muwekme Ohlone land. And one of the policies the university recently has adopted is to cede some office space for the Intertribal Council. And this is a very interesting development because it really kind of touches on many of the elements of my talk today. One is this notion of decolonization. What does it mean for Muslims, which is something Dr. Bashir brought up in the opening session, talking about the genealogy of the conference. So this idea of decolonizing or decoloniality is something that looms large in this talk, as well as in our larger atmosphere. So I would like to just begin off by saying that Muslims do have a role, I believe, in the university, but it is one in which it must be negotiated and it must be thought about in conjunction with people outside the university context. So a conference like this is absolutely critical for this kind of project. So it's interesting that so often the madrasa is portrayed as and remains depicted as the school of hate, as the site of indoctrination. This is something that we see in media narratives, in policy narratives. Now with the return in Afghanistan of the Taliban, we see the familiar tropes of Muslims being portrayed in a particular way. And so we have this reproduction of a certain kind of ideology in which Muslim institutions of education are viewed as part of this long history. And of course, this is very political and as part of the larger imperial agenda. What we rarely see is the depiction of the university as an instrument of imperial policy. We never look at, or we very rarely look at the university as an institution that is also complicit in imperial projects, whether it's training experts who then contribute to the occupation of countries around the world, who are involved in theory and policy around justifying imperial adventures in other parts of the world, whether it's even the psychologists who go on to torture people in other parts of the world, at the behest of American, British, and other institutions. So this is really important that we start understanding the Western university as an imperial institution, rather than give it this secular or somehow neutral kind of sheen, which it certainly does not deserve. There may be aspirations to objectivity, but we all know the history and there's enough research out there to show the university as an instrument of repression for many people around the world. Again, we're talking about the modernizing or colonial institution of the university. So when I think a lot of times when eyebrows are raised about the notion of Islamic education, we also have to problematize the Western imperial forms and the ways in which there is complicity. So that's one point to me. I mean, we just have to look at the American University of Afghanistan or American University of Iraq to see how this is illustrated in real time, and particularly in the context of the war on terror. At the same time, we have, since the 9/11, in particular, the emergence of Muslim activism. Of course, there's a long history that precedes Muslim activism on campuses. At the same time, we can say that we've seen the consolidation and the recognition of Muslims as as a group on campus, wherein university administrations recognize the need for some kind of protection or recognition that the politics of Muslims, the cultural practices differ somewhat from other groups. So in this larger context of diversity, of diversifying teaching, then the Muslims do also have a place in terms of articulating different needs, different, and more importantly, different epistemologies. So in that respect, if we go back to activism on campus, really my field, which is ethnic studies, at least I'm in an ethnic studies department, I come out of education. Ethnic studies was really an intervention in the epistemic order in the late 1960s. It emerges from the civil rights era, from the anti-war movement, the Black Power movement in California, particularly in Oakland, California. And so in so many respects, the Bay Area has been the site from which activists have attempted to push the notion of inclusion to its fullest expression, in the sense of changing not just the university in the sense of liberal multiculturalism, but towards a decolonizing approach. Of course, we know that the civil rights era, the era of third world liberation in the Western nations, is very much tied to decolonization in the post-war international arena. So a lot of times I think the discussion is, we forget to historicize it and see that the universities themselves, Western universities, were places where Muslim activists would meet to organize the decolonization of their nations from European colonial rule during World War II and afterwards, and actually before that. So we always know, we think of SOAS, we think of universities in London, the sites of the various conferences, Pan-African conferences, Black Writers conferences, and so forth, where African, Asian, Arab, Latin American scholars met to, and activists, students at the time met to formulate their objectives for independence from European colonial rule. So at the same time, we understand the university as an imperial institution, we can also look at it as a counter-hegemonic, anti-colonial history within the university. And I think we're seeing some scholarship that attempts to draw that out in recent years. So ethnic studies in 1969 emerges from the Black Power era. It's in the full swing of that intervention. It's taking place at San Francisco State, at UC Berkeley, universities which are where the personnel involved are closely connected to social movements. So that's one of the first points. Second point I would like to make is that social movements also must find a way into our analysis of knowledge and of power. If it were not for the social movements of the era, there would be no ethnic studies. And in many respects, ethnic studies itself is a product of someone like Malcolm X, Al-Hajj Malik al-Shabazz, who remains a very important figure in the lives of Muslims in the United States and the UK and in many countries around the world, in Canada as well, in South Africa. And so we have to, I think, in terms of thinking about the professionalization, the training, whether it's Darul Uloom on one hand or academic training, we also have to start to look at organic intellectuals and their roles within the academy. Certainly Malcolm X was the first to say sincerity is my only credentials, that he would be happy to return to the 8th grade classroom to pick up where he left off. But Malcolm X, maybe more than many Muslim scholars who have been trained in the Ulum ad-Din, is responsible for bringing people to Islam. The autobiography of Malcolm X, and this is where I get into the notion of Muslim pedagogy. The autobiography of Malcolm X, while obviously it is not a scriptural source, it points in the direction of scripture. It's an indicator that guides readers towards Islam in a way that very few American texts have done historically. And just to be a little personal here, in my own teaching in the Oakland County jail system, I taught the autobiography of Malcolm X, particularly the chapter Saved. And this was not in the capacity as spiritual education, but in terms of literacy, of reading comprehension. And I had my security clearance revoked for teaching that book. And it's not a bad thing to be kicked out of jail. But, the idea that we have a text that in many respects is able to inspire readers and to point them in the direction of alternative forms of knowledge. So often when we think of the theorists of education who animate our understanding, people like Paulo Freire, who is canonical within educational curricula, we've made this move towards Fanon, who we see as the key figure of decolonization. What I'm trying to show in some of my own research is how Malcolm X himself, Al-Hajj Malik al-Shabazz, embodies a certain kind of tradition of decolonization and a pedagogy in particular, an approach to teaching that is counter-hegemonic, an approach to knowledge seeking that is what I call literacy for self-determination, and that his Islamic conversion is an epistemic shift. So today we have all kinds of fancy words to describe, terminology to describe what's been happening for generations. We can go back, we think about Ngugi wa Thiong'o and his important decision to switch from writing in English to writing in Gikuyu, to his call for Swahili as the lingua franca of the African continent, in decolonizing the mind through a barrel of a pen. And we have, similarly, we have somebody like Malcolm X, Al-Hajj Malik al-Shabazz, who represents this embodied knowledge. If we think back to the history of Muslims in America, we have to engage with works of the scholars like Michael Gomez and Rudolph Ware and Samari Rashid, and Clyde Ahmed Winters, who came before them, who put the context of Islam in the Americas not as a new contemporary post-1965 phenomenon of immigration, but as you all know very well, as part of this larger global shift of Islamic knowledge heading westwards, from, even in the first instance, going from Mecca to Aksum, going to the, in the very first Hijra. And then we think about the African continent as a site in which the Islamic intellectual tradition takes root in places, of course, like Timbuktu and in West Africa, and of course, spreading into Al-Andalus. And so when we understand when we put Islamic knowledge and the teaching of Muslims in America in this larger global frame of African Islam, of Islam that moves westward and is part of the expansion of European colonialism on one hand, but it's also a movement of resistance against oppression. Christmas Day coming up will mark 500 years since the first recorded slave revolt in this continent. At least I'm on this side of the pond in the United States, wherein Wolof Muslims, in conjunction with Tainos, organized on the son of Christopher Columbus's plantation, Diego Colon, in Haiti, to overthrow the system of slavery. So we have Muslims, Wolof speaking, what we would probably say are Senegalese Muslims, organizing with indigenous people together to overthrow a system of slavery on Christmas Day and burning down the plantations. So it's in that tradition that I'm speaking here about ethnic studies as a field of counter-hegemonic knowledge production, in which the history is points in all directions towards one of shifting the paradigm from colonial formation of knowledge to what we can think of as being an anti-colonial, rather than maybe more so than decolonial. At any rate, when we think of Malcolm or Al-Hajj as an important figure, we're not focusing on an individual per se, but understanding he has a larger trajectory that is mirrored by so many other activists and individuals in the United States, in the Caribbean, in Canada, in Latin America. And so when we look at the rebellions in the 1830s in Bahia, in Brazil, where we see the Yoruba and Hausas attempting to use Islamic knowledge to resist Portuguese enslavement and being deported, right? So we talk about the Muslim ban of Donald Trump in 2016. Well, there was the Muslim ban of 1526 when Charles, Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, bans people of suspected Islamic leanings from coming to the US. So part of my role is then understanding how this pedagogy of Muslims in the United States is one of attempting to reconstruct the past, recover something that has been lost, obviously for political and goals as well as that of identity, but also to shift the paradigm in terms of decolonizing knowledge, as well as to understand the actual importance of organizing communities. Al-Hajj Malik al-Shabazz spoke at the university. He spoke on the streets. He was on television. He was at the Oxford Union, and he traveled throughout the African continent. Of course, his Hajj is also an important source for students in the United States to come in to understand his perspective on the relation of races. So when it comes to ethnic studies, we're talking about racial formation in a lot of respects that has historically tended to focus on four major groups: African Americans, Latinos, Native Americans, and Asian Americans. And Muslims, we know our conception of race in Islam is very complex and very nuanced, and in some ways transcends many of the Western sociological theories around race and racial formation in terms of how we configure race. And so understanding the Hajj and Talab al-Ilm as ways in which people travel to enrich themselves intellectually, but also to come into contact with one another as people from different contexts, is instructive to students of ethnic studies. So for me, in my courses, actually in the spring, I'll be teaching this Muslims in the Americas course, which attempts to look at Islam and by focusing on first on Muslim experience, and then pointing towards the intellectual tradition of Islam. So in so many ways, ethnic studies is going to foreground the actual experience of communities, but that doesn't mean it is limited there. If we talk about decolonization, then we have to start understanding the intellectual tradition embodied by Muslims, Talal Assad's understanding of the discursive, but in collective terms, and that the university itself is a site in which Muslims are transforming the physical space, the intellectual space, the nature of the politics, the understanding of what it means to protest, and certainly offering an alternative account of ethics that's very much connected to Quranic understanding, the notion of being humble, the notion of being able to instruct oneself before you instruct others, of respecting other opinions, whether or not you agree with them, but engaging in that intellectual way in which I think Muslims also have so much to offer the university setting, and conferences like this certainly are able to do that. Please cut me off at any time. I can go on and on and on. But the idea that when we start to look at borders and boundaries, whether they're racial, whether they're disciplinary, or whether they're geographic, also this is a prime moment in terms of our history to start questioning where we get these categories and start reconfiguring them. For instance, and this is the reason why I'm teaching this course as Muslims in the Americas, to also show how the movement of immigrants from the Sham, from Syria, from Lebanon, particularly to Latin America, and how that's kind of reshaped the culture. And now most people, Christians, Muslims, are embracing their Arab heritage. You know, it's interesting when you look at some of the, even our figures who are heads of state in Latin America, and you'll see how many of them have historically have had Arab background. And it's something that, of course, that's been assimilated into Latin American culture, but in places like, you know, Brazil and Argentina, and we see the very Panama, we see the very strong reemergence of Muslim communities doing something very similar. So part of my way of dislodging, I'm sorry?
Just one more minute.
Okay. Part of my way of dislodging the American exceptionalism is to start looking at other countries in the region and understanding what the experience of Muslim communities is like there. And this helps to bring us to a comparative perspective, which of course goes beyond fixed notions of race, of knowledge, and of community. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you for hearing me out. And I really, once again, appreciate your invitation to this conference. Jazakallah.